Okay, so let's take a look at some proofs involving triangle congruence. And the theorems we're going to use to prove triangle congruence are side angle side, hypotenuse leg, angle angle side angle, CPCTC, corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So that's where you're just proving a specific angle, pair of angles, or pair of legs congruent. And we're going to use the side theorem. So here we have a review of how the triangles look with certain theorems. And so the first one we have angle side angle, because here we see that we have a pair of congruent angles, congruent sides, that is a reflexive property, and a pair of congruent angles. Next, we have side because we have a pair of three congruent sides. So side, side, side. This is the reflexive property as well. Next, we have angle angle side, where we have those two adjacent angles. So angle angle side, angle angle side. So two adjacent angles and one non-included side. And then we have side angle side, so pair of congruent sides, so side. And then we have congruent angles and congruent side, again reflexive property. And last, we have the hypotenuse leg. We have to have a right triangle, so we have our right triangle right here. You have to have a pair of congruent legs, so right here. And you have to have a congruent hypotenuse, and so this is the hypotenuse in the center here. That is again a reflexive property. And remember, the hypotenuse is always that side opposite the right angle. So we know that this line in the middle here is the hypotenuse because it is opposite both right angles in these set of triangles. All right, so let's review a little bit here. So are the following triangles congruent? If so, state the theorem. So try to do these on your own. Look at each pair of triangles and see if they are congruent, and if so, state the congruence theorem. So go ahead and pause and try these four problems here. All right, so hopefully you got these correct. So the first two pairs of triangles are congruent. We have angle, side, angle. All right, and then side, side, side. Third set is not congruent because although we have two pair of congruent sides, we have these angles here and they are vertical angles. However, there is no side angle theorem, so these two triangles will not be congruent. And of course, the last one is hypotenuse leg. So hopefully you got those correct. All right, so let's prove some triangles congruent. And so let's look at some of the reasons that we could use to show congruence in our proofs. So if we want to prove two sides congruent, we could use, of course, the first statement is always given. So look at all of your given statements and just restate it. And the reason would be given. We have definition of a midpoint that creates two congruent sides. Also, we can use the reflexive property, again, where a segment is congruent to itself. And we have to prove angles congruent, of course, given. We can use vertical angles. Remember those intersecting angles that form congruent angles, or intersecting lines, rather. We have definition of an angle bisector. It creates two congruent angles. Corresponding angles, so if you ever see parallel lines, you can use that theorem, or you can use the alternate interior angles theorem, and again they must have a pair of parallel lines. So some reasons that we can use to prove congruency of triangles. So the first proof we have here, we want to prove that a triangle JMK is congruent to triangle LKM. So we always start our proofs with given statements. So our first given statement is JK. is congruent to LM, and of course that is given. And let's write our congruence marks in. So JK, which is this line here, is congruent to LM. Next, we have angle JKM is congruent to angle LMK. Again, that is a given statement. So let's label those congruent angles. So angle JKM would be this angle here. And then angle LMK is here. So we have these two congruent angles. And so what else do we need to prove? We have a pair of congruent sides and we have a pair of congruent angles. So do we have another pair of congruent sides or angles? And we actually do right here. Right here at the bottom, MK. Trying to draw a straight line here because they actually share that side. And so we could say that MK is, I meant to change the color back to black, but that is okay. We could say that MK is congruent to KM, right? And what property would that be? It is the same line, so that would be, of course, the reflexive property. Do we need any more information? We have a pair of congruent sides, right? We have a pair of congruent angles, right? Side angle, and then we have another pair or congruent sides using that reflexive property. So that would be side angle side. So we can simply say that we've proven this triangle congruent. Triangle JMK is congruent to triangle LKM because that is the side angle side theorem. So we have 5 boxes. We didn't need all of them because we were able to prove using this reflexive property here as well as this theorem and our given statements that these two triangles are in fact congruent. Let's take a look at these triangles here. We want to prove that triangle PQR is congruent to triangle TQS. So let's start out with our given statement here. And it says that Q is the midpoint, abbreviating midpoint, of PT and RS. So let's label that. It's always good to label as you prove. So I'm going to label Q as my midpoint here. And it is the midpoint of PT, so that helps us, that lets us know that PQ and QT are congruent because Q is the midpoint. And it's also the midpoint for RS as well, so that will make RQ and QS congruent. So we can actually write that in as our reason. So forgot to put given here. Change the color back. Alright, so PQ is congruent to TQ. How do we know that? Q is the midpoint. We could say that that is definition of a midpoint. We've also shown that RQ, alright, is congruent to SQ. So let's write that in. RQ is congruent to SQ. And again, we could say definition of a midpoint. So it's okay to use the same reason twice. That is completely okay. So what else do we need? We have 2 pair of congruent sides. Anything else that would be congruent? Yes, there is. We have these intersecting lines here. All right, and so since these lines intersect, these angles are congruent. Why are they congruent? Because they are vertical angles. So we could say that angle PQR is congruent to angle TQS. Alright, because they are vertical angles. Do we have enough information? So let's see. We have pair of congruent sides. Alright, congruent angles. Okay, and another pair of congruent sides. So this one is also congruent, or these triangles are also congruent by side angle side. So our last statement is to just write that triangle PQR is congruent to triangle TQS, and that is because of the side angle side theorem. Alright, so let us try one more before you try one on your own. Alright, starting out with given. AC bisects angle BAD and angle BCD. So write that in. AC bisects. It's giving us some information here. Angle BAD and angle BCD. Kind of going over into my next column here, but that is okay. And that is a given statement. So what does that tell us? AC, so this line here bisects angle BAD, angle BAD, and so, and it bisects angle BCD, BCD. And so that tells us something. That tells us that these angles are congruent here as well as these, because AC bisects them, so it cuts both of those angles in half equally. So we could say that angle BAC is congruent to angle DAC, and that is definition of angle bisector. So when you're doing proofs, always look at what you're given and what else your given statement actually tells you about the figure that you're given. All right. And what else is congruent? Well, we can say that angle BAC, I'm sorry, BCA, not BAC, we just used BAC. So BCA is congruent to angle DCA. Again, definition of an angle bisector. All right. So we have two pair of congruent angles, and so we need one more statement and reason, because we need three to use one of our theorems. And what do we know right here? We have the reflexive property, because that is the same line that each triangle shares. So we could say that AC is congruent to AC, or CA, and that is the reflexive property. Alright, so we have a pair of congruent angles, congruent sides, and congruent angles. So what theorem would that be? That would be angle, side, angle, and I'm just going to go back and write in what I've proved here. I've proved that triangle ABC is congruent to ADC. So we have proven these two triangles congruent using the angle, side, angle theorem. Alright, so why don't you try this problem on your own? Go ahead and pause the video and try to prove these two triangles congruent. So hopefully, these are the answers here, or our proof here. Okay, so hopefully you got the information correct. Statements 3 and 4 can be switched out. Alright, so if you have those two statements in flipped for 3 and 4, that is okay. And also statements 1 and 2. And remember that anytime you see that in your given statements that two of your lines are parallel, always look to see alternate interior angles or corresponding angles in that figure. So check your work and hopefully you got it correct. And again, we have another side angle side, or a pair of triangles proved by side angle side. So let's take a look at some proofs using CPCTC. I'm going to do one proof involving that, and you will try one on your own. All right, so in this proof right here, we want to prove that angle WXZ, so WXZ, which is this angle right here, we want to prove that that angle is congruent to angle YXZ. So we want to prove that these two angles are congruent. So let's start out with our given statement. Triangle WZX and triangle YZX are right triangles. So that tells us something, that they are right triangles. That is given. And we have WX is congruent to YX. That is also given. So WX is congruent to YX. That is given. And so whenever we see a pair of triangles that share a side, we can automatically conclude that that's a pair of congruent sides because it's the same side. So that is the reflexive property. So let's write that in. XZ is congruent to XZ, reflexive property. All right, and so let me just erase this here because we're proving that these two angles are congruent, so we haven't gotten there yet. All right, so we have two pair of congruent sides that are congruent. So we want to prove that these two triangles are congruent. We have a right triangle here. This is actually the hypotenuse of both of these triangles, right? So we have a pair of hypotenuses that are congruent, and we have a side here, and this is a right triangle. These would be legs. So we have a hypotenuse and legs that are congruent. What theorem would that be? That would be the hypotenuse leg. And so we could say that triangle WXZ is congruent to triangle YXZ by the hypotenuse leg. And so since these two triangles are congruent, we can automatically conclude that these two angles are congruent. Angle WXZ is congruent to angle YXZ because of CPCTC. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So we proved that the triangles are congruent using the HL theorem. Therefore, all of the corresponding parts would be congruent. So a helpful hint if you're trying to prove that two parts or a pair of parts are congruent for a triangle, that last step before CPCTC is going to always be one of your theorems here. So in this case, we used HL. All right, so next you're going to try one on your own. I would like for you to try this one on your own. You're proving that a pair of sides are congruent. And so again, remember that you're going to use one of those other theorems to prove that the triangles are congruent first before you show that the pair of sides are congruent. So go ahead and pause the video and try this one on your own. Okay, so hopefully you got this proof correct. Again, you know your given statements can be flipped, as well as statements 3 and 4 can be flipped. The last statement before CPCTC should be one of your triangle theorems. And so I hope that you got this proof correct. All right, so we've reached the end of our lesson. I want to Thank you for learning with me some related videos here, triangle theorems, perpendicular bisectors of triangles. So if you have not already, go ahead and subscribe, share, like, and comment as well. And once again, thank you for learning with me.